Hello, this is Arielle from Inconspicuous Bear. I'll be narrating the heroic version of the Ursoc encounter in Emerald Nightmare from a Guardian point of view. Ursoc is a fairly demanding tank encounter that mostly revolves around swapping between two debuffs and includes some minor movement and an enrage phase at the end. Overall, this is probably one of the harder tank fights in Heroic Emerald Nightmare, probably on par with Xavius in terms of damage taken, but significantly more complicated in terms of just your overall execution of the fight as a tank. The primary tank mechanics in the Ursoc encounter revolve around managing two separate debuffs and making sure one tank never ends up with both debuffs at the same time. The first one is called Overwhelm, which is basically triggered by a physical special attack that deals damage and then gives you a debuff for 12 seconds. This debuff increases physical damage taken and increases damage by the other debuff, which is Rend Flesh. Rend Flesh is just basically a bear version of Rake. It has initial bleed damage and some bleed damage on top of that. However, what usually ends up happening is you will have one Overwhelm, then a Rend Flesh, then another Overwhelm, and by the time the third Overwhelm comes, the first Rend Flesh will have fallen off, and then you just keep swapping like that. Normally, what this means is that you basically just end up swapping on every single debuff application. So if tank A gets Overwhelm, then tank B taunts for Rend Flesh, and then when that happens, tank A taunts back again for another Overwhelm, and then tank B taunts back again for another Overwhelm, and that just keeps going throughout the entire encounter. There are three secondary mechanics in this encounter whose primary purpose is to trigger the movement of both the tanks and the raid. This sequence starts with Roaring Cacophony, which is just a bunch of physical damage split between everyone in range to soak it. Pretty much everyone should always be in range of this on Heroic. This is followed by something called Miasma, which is basically just a pool on the ground that you shouldn't stand in because it's taking shadow damage. And then the third one is Nightmarish Cacophony, which basically means anyone still standing in a Miasma pool the next time Roaring Cacophony is cast takes additional damage and is feared, but that should never happen because you should always be moving out of Miasma as soon as Roaring Cacophony causes it to appear. And you also don't want to cause the room to fill up too fast. So basically, Roaring Cacophony will happen, then you will take a few steps backwards to get yourself out of the Miasma, and then it'll happen again. You take a few more steps out, and then you sit there and wait for the first one to happen. The cycle repeats throughout the entire fight, so you end up taking some sidestepping or some backing up pretty consistently throughout the encounter. It's not anything that requires overt attention, but it is something that you'll just get into a pattern of doing, and eventually you just won't even notice it. The third set of mechanics you'll generally never have to worry about involve pretty much the entire set of raid damage throughout the encounter. These are two things called Momentum and Barreling Impact. Momentum will cause anyone who basically touches the bear while he's charging to take 500k or so extra physical damage during the charge animation, and then once he reaches his destination, he will do an AoE damage to the entire raid based on the number of people he hit while traveling. As a tank on Heroic, this should probably never be a thing that you have to pay attention to. There will always be enough people in the raid to soak the momentum charges, and you'll never actually need to bother to get in the way. This changes on Mythic, but I'll let Kaelin talk about that. Finally, at the end of the encounter, Ursoc will gain Frenzy, which basically increases his attack speed by 20% and his damage by 25%, which causes his melee attacks to do an overall increased 50% damage, on top of increasing his roars, charges, and overwhelms and rend fleshes by the aforementioned 25% damage. This is particularly dangerous if you are not prepared for it. This is definitely where you want to be rolling cooldowns, especially for the melee second overwhelm melee combos, because those serve as even further multipliers on top of the frenzy, and you can be pretty easily taken out if you're not prepared for them. Otherwise, as long as you're just rolling cooldowns throughout this entire phase, you should be fine. It's not something that is like really difficult to handle if you're prepared for it, but if you're not prepared for it, it can definitely catch you off guard. talent selection for Ursoc primarily depends on how comfortable you are staying alive. If you are very comfortable, you can obviously just take brambles for the extra damage. If you are more worried about survival, then Bristling Fur is definitely the MVP of this encounter, because you can always have it up when you taunt after your co-tank gets a second Overwhelm while you still have Rend Flesh. It'll cause you to generate a bunch of rage and basically stay alive pretty easily during that particular stretch of time. For affinities, you can technically take Feral and Catweave. It's extremely dangerous, and you should only do it if you're very comfortable with the fight. Otherwise, just stick with Resto. Galactic Guardian, obviously, because it's the best talent in the row. You could make an argument for Guardian of the Loon versus Earth Warden. However, Earth Warden becomes very unreliable, or not necessarily unreliable, but its usefulness tanks during the enrage, which is where you need your survival the most. Therefore, you just take Guardian of the Loon, and obviously pick Rend and Terror Pulverize. If you have Elise's the legendary legs, you will pick Rend and Terror 100% of the time. Otherwise, if you're okay with Pulverize, it will outperform Rend and Terror on this encounter, but if you don't want to bother with it, then Rend and Terror will also serve you just fine. There are no Guardian-specific tricks or tips or anything for this encounter. Most of your attention is going to be focused on making sure that you swap correctly. If you mess up a swap, or your co-tank messes up a swap, it's really difficult to recover from it. So make sure that you are putting most of your focus into doing that. I already mentioned before that Bristling Fur is really strong on this encounter. Also, making sure that you have Iron Fur up to as many stacks as you can for the second Overwhelm is really helpful. And then once you get into Enrage, pretty much just make sure that you're rotating through Barkskin and Rage of Sleeper and both charges of Survival Instincts when you are tanking, and then calling for externals as needed. I hope you enjoyed this video, and good luck in Emerald Nightmare. So she takes the Overwhelm, I get the Rend Flesh.
Move. This one's evens. And Mirrors is HT.
I think I did that wrong.
Do you need something?
No, I'll be okay.
Alright.
Yeah, drink.
Hey.
I don't like seeing health bars.
Okay. Now I take that one.
What are you talking about?
He fucks up on this fight. Health
This
bars.
one's odd. And Trank.
Hero.
That's over.
Sorry, already did. Move. Move. We're not getting another one.